Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. All my thanks and gratitudes are for Almighty Allah for His uncountable blessings. I am Waqar Ahmad, a visiting teacher at University of Education at a campus. The topic of my online lecture is Character of Jane Eyre with respect to different critical theories. First of all, I would like to give you some introduction about the Charlotte Bronte. Jane Eyre is written by famous talented English woman novelist Charlotte Bronte in 1846. It is Charlotte Bronte's second novel and is one of her masterpieces. In this work, Charlotte Bronte pictures an amazing female heroine, Jane Eyre, in British literature. Although having more than 152 years by now, this work is popular with a lots of people because of its heroine Jane Eyre. Charlotte Bronte portrayed the woman in Victorian England as a representation of her own life. Charlotte Bronte portrayed the woman in Victorian England as a representation of her own life through the content of Jane Eyre, through the character of Jane Eyre. Victorian literature has become a very important source of historical facts and the lifestyle of the 19th century England society, mainly because it relies on a realistic mode of representations. Victorian era was a time of development of science, so Victorian explained related to their historical and social content such as industrialization, rural-urban life, and the condition of children and women. There is a famous quote of the Charlotte Bronte: "Better to be without logic than without feelings." She was one of the foremost romantic novelists, along with her sister Emily and Anne Bronte. In Victorian era, there were only two things for an ideal woman. First is marriage and the second is procreation. Talking about sex, talking about other outward things away from home was not permitted. In such an atmosphere, Charlotte Bronte, she took this bold step to talk about a woman, Jane Eyre, in a different ways, in a different shade, in a different colors. She wanted to give a model to Victorian women. She wanted to show that a woman should be true to herself. A woman should be true to her womanhood first, and she do what she really wants to. She should respect her inner feelings and she should succumb the societal pressure or not. This is a message given by Charlotte Bronte through the words of the novel of Jane Eyre. Charlotte Bronte was one of the foremost romantic novelists of the 19th century. Her magnum opus, Jane Eyre, was written under the pseudonym Currer Bell. It was published in 1847. Charlotte Bronte revealed her identity only after it was acclaimed by the readers. This was due to the notion that women writers were not accepted well during the Victorian period. Now the question comes in front of us: why did she write under a pen name? The answer is the Victorian society was not very favorable for women writers, so they choose just a name which could not decipher or explain the identity of the authors. Growing up in a Victorian England, the Bronte sisters were inspired by romantic writers of their time like Sir Walter Scott, Wordsworth, Lord Byron, and Charles Dickens. Jane Eyre was written in 1847 is a novel based on Bronte's autobiography which examines many shades of her life. Through Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte represents a figure of the Victorian time and sports light on the lives of the women. Women were living in misogynist world and under the male-dominated. In fact, women were deprived of many rights granted to men and had consequently a very low status in society. Jane is similar to the Charlotte Bronte physically, who was small, plain-looking woman like her heroine. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte opens with Jane, an orphan, isolated 10 years old, living with a family and dislikes her. She grows in strength, excels at school, becomes a governess, and falls in love with Edward Rochester. After being deceived by him, Jane goes to Marsh End, where she regains her spirituality and discovers her own strength. By the novel's end, Jane is a strong, independent woman. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre still raises relevant questions to the readers today. Here are 8 important things to remember about the Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is a Bildungsroman, coming of an age novel, or coming of age novel. For example, Bildungsroman's novel means a novel about the moral and psychological growth of the main character. Other examples of this form include Great Expectation by the Charles Dickens. Jane Eyre is a typical coming of the age novel. In its main character, Jane is a young, brave and resourceful in the face of the difficulty and even danger. As a result, she is easy to the reader to sympathize with. The phrase coming of age literally means the character is maturing and coming closer to adulthood. The second important fact is Jane Eyre is a Gothic novel. Gothic novel focus on the mysterious, taking place in dark, sometimes exotic settings. Often houses that appears to be haunted, but still entail an element of romance. The double is a frequent feature of the Gothic novel. In essence, Jane and the mad woman in the Rochester attic are doubles, 2 wives, one of the sound mind and the other insane. The third important fact is the most famous line in the Jane Eyre is, "Reader, I married him." This line is significant not only in that it provides the novel with a happy ending, but also because of its active quality, which was probably shocking at the time of the novel's publication. The line, "Reader, he married me," would have been more conventional. The fourth important point is Sir John River and Mr. Rochester are foils, meaning opposite one another, especially in relation to the Jane. Sir John is cold and dispassionate, while Mr. Rochester is wildly indulgent and passionate. Even their physiques are a foil. Mr. Rochester is not handsome, but he does have extremely masculine features. On the other hand, Sir John is classically beautiful. At one point, he is described as Athenian, which recalls a grandized statue of the mind. Jane Eyre is rebellious in a world demanding obedient woman. In her own way, Jane rebels against Miss Reed, Sir John's River, and even Mr. Rochester, the man she marries at the end of the book. Jane's personality contains many qualities that would be considered desirable in an English woman. She is frank, sincere, and lacks personal vanity, but the rebel streak she has is targeted as inequalities of society. Jane reacts strongly when she is discredited due to her class or gender. The sixth important thing is one primary theme is class conflict. Although English society has a very strict hierarchy, movement throughout the Jane Eyre reveals through these lines being blurred. The seventh important fact is gender conflict is a theme that spreads throughout the Jane Eyre. Time and again, Jane is vulnerable to a patriarchal class system that does not always have her best interest in mind. The last important fact is a major symbol in Jane Eyre is that of Thornfield's burning. Prior to meeting Jane, Mr. Rochester is impulsive and wild. He wanted to change and tries to use Jane's purity to help motivate his transformation. Even with Jane's influence, Mr. Rochester can't change. It's not until Thornfield burns down and Mr. Rochester loses his hand and sight that he is able to change. Symbolically, it is as if his lies and patience have finally exploded. Now Mr. Rochester can change with the help of Jane and be the perfect husband. Now let's come to the character of Jane Eyre. Jane is written by famous talented English woman novelist Charlotte Bronte in 1846. This work is popular with lots of people because of its heroine Jane Eyre. In the early years of the 19th century Victorian age, it is male-dominated and money above all societies, and women are regarded as a second class. Unexpectedly emerging a girl who disdains money and power and has a great courage to combat traditional injustice and oppression. Everyone has his or her own standard for what is beauty. Generally, there are two kinds of beauty: physical beauty and the inner beauty. In Jane's period, people usually measure a person on the basis of social status, wealth, and physical beauty. On the contrary, Jane is an orphan, penniless and plain. She possesses neither wealth nor physical beauty, which are considered symbol of a woman's social position in her time. However, our heroine has a unique character that makes her beauty everlasting. Little Jane is an orphan, brought up by her despotic and prejudiced aunt. In her aunt's gates here, Jane is treated cruelly. Being rebellious, she is packed off to a charity school. The school's condition is very poor and its administration is harsh and severe. Jane sets herself to learn and qualifies herself as a teacher. Then Jane is ambitious to advertise for a post and leave the charity school to be a governess. In Jane's path of life, she dares to challenge traditional opinion and oppression. Jane whited mind and the independent character win others' respect for her. Her indomitable spirit changed her fate. No matter how difficult and strenuous, she never gave up struggling for freedom and equality. Jane is a marvelous person, a beautiful feminist. The development for the character of the Jane Eyre is the development of Jane Eyre's character is central to the novel. From the beginning, Jane possesses a sense of self-worth, dignity, and commitment to justice and principle, a trust in God, and a passionate disposition. Her integrity is continually tested over the course of the novel, and Jane must learn to balance the frequently conflicting aspect of herself so as to find contentment. As an orphan since childhood, Jane feels exiled and ostracized at the beginning of the novel, and the cruel treatment she received from her aunt Reed and her cousin only exacerbates her feelings of alienation. Afraid that she will never find a true sense of home and community, Jane feels the need to belong somewhere, to find kin and at least kindred spirits. This desire tempers her equally intense need for autonomy and freedom. In her search for freedom, Jane also struggles with the question of what type of freedom she wants. While Rochester initially offers Jane a chance to liberate her passions, Jane comes to realize that such freedom should also be enslavement. By living with Rochester's mistress, she would be sacrificing her dignity, integrity for the sake of her feelings. St. John's River offers Jane another kind of freedom, the freedom to act unreservedly on her principles. He opens to Jane possibility of exercising her talent fully by the working and living with him in India. Jane eventually realizes though this freedom would also constitute a form of imprisonment because he would be forced to keep her true feeling and her true passions always in check. The feministic elements of her personality are evident in her struggle for freedom and her efforts to maintain a position in life devoid of any depth to others. She tries to assert her identity in a male dominated society. Also, her stronger sense of morality makes her refuse to be Mr. Rochester paramount. Charlotte Bronte may have created the character of Jane Eyre as a means of coming at terms with elements of her own life. Much evidence suggests that Bronte too struggled to find a balance between love and freedom and to find others who understood her. At many points in the book, Jane voices the author's then radical opinions on religion, social class, and gender. There are some quotes taken from the novel Jane Eyre. I would like to explain just these quotes. At the beginning of the novel, Jane describes her struggles as a dependent at Gateshead Hall. In this scene, Jane is locked in the Red Room as punishment. Jane insists that her strong personality, plans, look, and refusal to accept mistreatments are what ultimately cause the discord between herself and the household. This description reveals to the readers how Jane's mistreatment at Gateshead negatively affect her emotional well-being. However, Jane's personality traits will serve her well later in life. The further explanation of the quote is Jane describes her life as a lowered school and her feeling at the end of the 8 years she spent there. She recounts her strong work ethic, growth and accomplishment, but then reveals that she is growing restless and ready to explore the world. Jane exhibits her adventurous and courageous spirits once again as she seeks freedom from the lowered school life. Jane arrives at Thorntree to a warm welcome from Mrs. Fairfax, and it is immediately filled with an overwhelming feeling of gratitude for this new chapter in her life. Jane describes that she finally feels safe, comfortable, content, and hopeful while acknowledging that her past life was cold, dark, and Jane chooses to focus on her new situation with thankful heart and renewed optimism. The explanation of the further quotes are: on the morning of her first day at Thornfield, Jane describes to the reader how she pays attention to looks her best without being too absorbed with physical appearance. She admits that she sometimes wishes she was more physically beautiful with specific sought after feature. This quote reveals basic details about Jane's appearance and also shows her own self-awareness. As Jane and Mr. Rochester get to know each other, Mr. Rochester shares his observation of Jane. He describes her as a charming, quiet and humble, even comparing her to a nunnette, little nun. However, Mr. Rochester also points out that Jane also answers questions directly with strength and honesty. Mr. Rochester recognizes Jane's character quickly and with accuracy. He admires the same personality traits in Jane that once again other people in her life. Here Jane describes how she feels after the truth comes out that Mr. Rochester cannot marry her because he is already married. Following the revelation of this deception, she feels lost and alone again. These lines dramatize her desperation at realizing that everything she felt before this news is lost to her. She has not only lost Mr. Rochester but also her hope, dreams, and confidence in herself. And the last quote of Jane Eyre is, Jane and Mr. Rochester discusses their reunited love and future plan. Jane passionately declares that she wants nothing more than to spend her life with Mr. Rochester. In this declaration, Jane shows her genuine character as someone who treasures loving and being loved. She knows that having this kind of love and happiness is everything she has ever wanted. Psychoanalytical criticism and Jane Eyre. The development of psychoanalytical theory, derived from the work of Sigmund Freud, has had a major influence on the literary criticism in a wide variety of ways. The following are particularly relevant to the Jane Eyre. The relationship between the writer and the text. This approach would concentrate on Bronte's own experience, such as her lack of mother, the time she spent at Cowan Bridge School, and her supposed isolation and ignorance of sexual love. These can also be seen in a result of romantic plot that operates in a kind of wished fulfillment. Such interpretations are not always based on reliable biographical knowledge. Such interpretations are not always based on reliable biographical knowledge. The next is analysis of character in psychological terms. Here critics concentrate on how character behaves, treating them as psychological cases. Miss Reed would be a suitable character for study, particularly in relation to the loss of her husband and her inability to handle responsibility. The highly repressed Mr. Brocklehurst, with his distaste for natural, could be seen as an example of a man who uses strict religious practices as a means of concealing his own psychological problems. Women had been associated with the flesh and sexual passion. Thus, Bertha Mason, the deranged creature who lives in Rochester attic and has a hold on his life, can be seen as a symbolic of his lust or passions. Sir John River as an example of a personality undergoing conflict between a sense of duty and his passionate feelings for someone else, where he allows himself to give away to his feelings at a set time. This maiming of Rochester at the novel's end could be seen as a sort of castration of his passion and physical probes, although that does not take account of his subsequently fathering children by Jane. Family and parent-child relationship. Critics might also concentrate on the varieties of such relationships to be found in the novel. As in many 19th century novels, there is a distinct absence of parents, and hardly any of the novel's main character, Jane, the Reed children. Many of the pupils at Lowood School, Adele, have grown up in a stable or complete family. Children might have in poor relationship with their parents. Rochester, for instance. There are a number of surrogate parents, such as Miss Reed, Brocklehurst, Miss Temple, and Mr. Rochester, at the first two of whom are highly unsatisfactory. Next is the relationship between the reader and the text. This approach would concentrate on the reader's response to the novel and how readers in some way work or collude with the author in the act of reading to construct meaning or satisfy unconscious wishes by their response to characters and events. This is a theoretical way of stating that readers usually have empathy or sympathy with one or more of the novel's character and may therefore identify psychologically with the fortune of that character. In case of Jane Eyre, a good deal of the reader's understanding of the novel depends on the degree of his or her sympathy or hostility toward Jane. Reader will also bring to their reader their own expectation, often derived from their previous reading of the novels and how they resolved. For example, in relation to the relationship between Jane and Rochester, do novel always end in marriage? The next is the construction of identity in relation to the social order. Throughout the novel, we see Jane engage in the construction of her own identity in relation to her dead parents, to her changing environment, and to the rules of the social orders. This is particularly true in relation to the construction of gender identity. In early part of the novel, Jane is constantly being told that her behavior is inappropriate for a girl. At various points in the book, Jane is presented with constrainting model of female behavior and becomes aware of the constraint of social expectation without women. Now there is 3 examples of psychoanalytical readings. A good example of how a critic might apply psychoanalytical approach to the Jane Eyre and can be found in Elaine Showalter's A Literature of Their Own, which as its title suggests was an early example of how the new feministic literary history. The second, in Jane Eyre's, Bronte depicts a complex female identity, and she expresses her heroine's consciousness through an extraordinary range of narrative devices. Psychologically, development and the dramas of their inner lives are represented in the dreams, hallucination, vision, surrealistic paintings, and master grades. The sexual experiences of the female body are expressed especially through elaborate and rhythmically recurring images of the room and houses. Jane's growth and future strength through a pattern of literary, biblically, and mythologically allusion. Bronte's most profound innovation, however, in the division of the Victorian female psyche into the extreme component of the mind and body, which she extremized as 2 characters, Helen Burns and the Bertha Mason. Both Helen and the Bertha function at realistic level in the narrative and represent implied and explicit connection to the Victorian sexual ideology, but they also operate in an archetypical dimensional of the story. Bronte gives us not one but 3 faces of Jane, and she resolves her heroine's psyche dilemmas by literally and metaphorically destroying of the 2 polar personality to make a way from the full strength and development of the central consciousness for the integration of the spirit and the body. The second example is another way of using this approach can be found in Angela Carter's essay on Jane Eyre, written in 1990 and published in her collection Expletive Deleted in 1992. For Jane Eyre, love is a means of existential definition and exploration of the potential of herself, rather than the means of induction into the contingent existence of the married woman, as it had been for the previous heroines of the Borgias novel. Jane Eyre is a particularly uncertain blend of penetrating psychological realism of the violent and intuitive feminism of a surprising from sociological grasp, and of the utterly non-realistic apparatus of the psychosexual fantasy, irresistible passion, madness, violent death, dream, and telepathic communications. The third is in 20th century novelists were generally illustrated in other dimensions of the psychological approach in her essay Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights in 1916, where she reads the novel as an experience of Charlotte Bronte personality. Charlotte Bronte does not attempt to solve the problem of human life. She is even unaware of such problem exists in all her forces. force. It is the more tremendous for being constructed goes into the assertion, I love, I hate, I suffer, for the self-centered and self-limited writers have a power denied the more Catholic and broad-minded. Their impressions are close-packed and strongly stamped between their narrow walls. Nothing issued from their minds which has not been marked with their own impress. In other words, read Charlotte Bronte not for exhaustive observation of characters. Her characters are vigorous, elementary, not for comedy. Here is a grim and crude, not for the philosophical views of life. Here is that of a country patient's daughter, but for her poetry. Probably that is so with all the writers who have, as she has, an overpowering personality, so that, as we say in real life, they have only to open the door to make themselves felt. A post-colonial approach to the Jane Eyre. As a theoretical approach, post-colonialism asks readers to consider the way colonialist and anti-colonialist messages are presented in literary text. It argues that Western culture is Eurocentric, meaning it represents European values are natural and universal, while Eastern ideas are, for example, inferior, immoral, and savage. A post-colonial approach to Jane Eyre might begin by considering the following question: what does the novel reveals about the way cultural difference was represented in Victorian culture? How did Britain justify its colonialist project by imaging the East as a savage or uncivilized? What idea does the text create of proper British behavior? Tentative answer to these questions can be discovered by examining the novel's representation of foreign women, especially Bertha Mason, and the colonialist doctrines of Jane and Sir John Rivers. One of the colonialist goals of this novel is to create a prototype of the proper English woman, sometimes like Jane, who is frank, sincere, and lacking in personal vanity. This ideal is created by the Jane's attempt to construct herself with the foreign woman in the text. For example, both Celine and Varens, her daughter, are constantly criticized in the novel for their supposed superficiality and materialism. According to Rochester, Celine Varens charming the English girls out of their British breeches, a comment that emphasized his supposedly British innocence and her willily French ways. Supposing this idea, Jane comments that Adele has a superficiality of character hardly congenial to the English mind. Jane's final ethnocentric movement in the relation to the little Adele are significant. A sound English education corrected in a great measure for French defects. Only through a good English lifestyle has Adele avoided her mother's tragic flaws, materialism, and sensuality. Characteristics that the novel specifically associated with the foreign woman. Jane comments imply that the English, unlike their French neighbors, are deeply rather than superficial, spiritual rather than materialistics. But Jane's position is more conflicted than Rochester's. As a woman, she is also a member of colonized group, but as a specifically British woman, she is colonizer. When she claims Rochester gives her a smile such as a sultan would bestow on a slave, his gold and gems have enriched. She emphasizes the colonized status of all women, insisting that he preferred his own one little English curls to the Grand Turk's wall seraglio. Rochester pointed to the Jane powerlessness, her reduction to the sex slave. Rather than becoming slave, Jane insisted she will become a missionary, preaching liberty to the women enslaved in harems. Her comment shows the dual position of European women, both colonized and colonizers. While Rochester reduced her to a colonized doll, her performing app. Her comment shows her Eurocentric understanding of Eastern culture. She implies that she will be the enlightenment English woman coming to the rescue of poor, abused Turkish women. All women are enslaved by male despotism, but the British women claim a moral and spiritual superiority over the Eastern sisters. This difference becoming intense in Jane representation of Bertha Mason. Bertha's vampiric appearance, she looks like a vampire, suggests she is sucking the lifeblood away from the innocent Rochester, who tells Jane he was innocent as she is until he turned 21 and was married to Bertha. His goodness was taken by this savage woman. An insane Creole woman, Bertha represents British fear of both foreigners and women. The blood red moon, a symbol of women, menstrual cycles, is reflected in her eyes, suggesting her feminine sexual pretense. Unlike Jane, Bertha refuses to be controlled. A woman whose stature almost equals her husband's, she fights with him, displaying a virile force that almost masters Rochester. Post-colonial critics argues that Bertha, the foreign woman, is sacrificed so that the British Jane can achieve self-identity. This argument suggests Rochester is not an innocent as he claimed. As a colonialist, he was in the West Indies to make money and to overpower colonized women and men. Notice how both Jane and Rochester emphasizes his inability to control Bertha's brother, Richard. Most of the Rochester's critique of Bertha hinges of her sexuality and exotic excesses. When the first met her, Rochester's senses were aroused by her dazzle, splendor, and lusciousness. When he later found her, when Rochester senses were aroused by her dazzle, splendor, and lusciousness, but he later found her debauchery for her Indian Messalina attribute. Thus, the characteristic that first attracted her to him, her sensual excesses, soon repels him. The representation of Bertha represent native peoples in the colonies are coarse, lascivious, and ignorant, thus justifying St. John's missionary rules. Bertha is a foreign savage, is in need of British guidance and enlightenment. Just as Jane restrains the mind of her lower class students in England, St. John's will reforms the value of the pagans in India. Both the characters perpetuate a belief in British Christian based moral and spiritual superiority, but St. John's inability to renounce his wide field of mission welfare shows that his colonialist impulse is not based on compassion or mutual understanding, but on violence, violating the minds of the native peoples, if not their bodies. A Marxist approach to the Jane Eyre. Based on the idea of Karl Marx, this theoretical approach asks us to consider how a literary work reflects the socio-economic condition of the time in which it was written. What does the text tell us about the contemporary social classes, and how does it reflect classicism? Jane Eyre depicts the strict hierarchical class system in England that requires everyone to maintain carefully circumscribed class position. Primarily through the character of Jane, it also exists the cracks in the system, the places where the class differences were melding in Victorian England. For example, the novel question the role of the governor. Should she be considered upper class based on her superior education, or lower class because her servant status within the family? What happens when relationship develops between the people of different classes such as Rochester and Jane? Jane's ambiguous class status becomes evident from the novel's opening chapter. A poor orphan living with relatives, Jane feels alienated from the rest of the Reed's family. John Reed tells Jane she has no business to take her books. You are a dependent. You ought to beg, not to live here with gentlemen's children like us. In this quote, Jones claims the rights of the gentleman, implying that Jane's family was to form a lower classes, and therefore she has no right to associate an equal footing with her wealthy cousins. Jane's lacking of the money leaves her dependent upon the Reeds for sustenance. She appears to exist in a no man's land between the upper and the servant classes. By calling her cousin John a murderer, slave driver, and Roman emperor, John emphasizes the recognition of the corruption inherited in the ruling classes. As she is taken away from the Red Rooms following her fight with the John Reed, Jane insists her captor like a rebel slave, emphasizing the oppression she suffered because of her class status. When Miss Abbott admired Jane for striking the John Reed, Jane's young master, Jane immediately questioned her terminology. Is John really her master? She is a servant, emphasizing the corruption, even despotism of the upper classes. Jane's narrative makes her audience aware of the middle classes for becoming the repositories of both moral and intellectual superiority. Jane's experience at the Tonfleet reinforces this message. Both the Jane first arrive, and she is happy to learn that Miss Fairfax is housekeeper and not Jane's employer, because this means they are both dependent on, can therefore interact as equal. Miss Fairfax discusses the difference between herself and an upper servant and the other servant in the house. For example, she says, Lee and John are only servants, and one cannot converse with them in terms of equality. One must keep them as due distance to fear of the losing one's authority. As a governess, Jane is in the same category as Miss Fairfax, neither a member of the family nor a member of the serving class. The ambiguity of the governess is especially pronounced, as well as we see with the example of Diana and Mary Rivers, the well-educated daughters of the upper-class parents who have fallen on hard financial times. The Rivers are the better educated than their employer, though treated with an as little respect as the family cook. The relationship between the Jane and Rochester also emphasizes the class issues. In a conversation preceding their betrothal, Rochester treats Jane like a good servant because she has been a dependent who has done her duty. He as her employer wants to offer her assistance in finding a new job. Jane confirms her secondary status by referring to the Rochester as a master and believing customs separate her from him. She fears he will be treated her like an automaton because she is poor, obscure, plain and little, mistakenly believing the lower classes to be heartless and soulless. Before she can become Rochester's wife, Jane must prove her accessibility based on the class. Does she have an upper class sensibility despite her inferior position in Thornfield? For example, when besides sees Jane at a lower, she is impressed because Jane has become quite a lady. In fact, her accomplishments surpass that of her cousins, yet they are still considered her social superior based solely on wealth. The conversation emphasizes the ambiguities of the Jane family class status and of the class system in general. Should a lady be judge based on academic accomplishment, money, and or family name. The novel critiqued the behavior of the most of the upper-class character Jane meets. John reads. John reads. One of the Jane's tasks in the novel is revitalize the upper classes, which has become mired in a social system. Just as Rochester sought Jane for her freshness and purity, the novel suggests that the upper class in general needs to be pure moral value and stringent work ethic of the middle classes. As novel and Rochester recognizes the error in her lifestyle and his excessive passion have been questioned. He is reborn as an upper, mild-mannered husband, happily dependent on his wife's moral and intellectual guidance. It's all about my lecture as discussion on the character of Jane Eyre and different views about the Jane Eyre of this lectures. In this lecture, we have discussed the character of Jane Eyre with respect to the different critical theories. So take care.